Welcome Year 12 to this video on Gwen Harwood's Father and Child Barn Owl. Like your other poetry videos, make sure that you have your poetry booklet with you. You should be annotating your own copy of Barn Owl as we go through it today. Make sure that you are annotating in a way that makes sense to you. Okay, so before we dive into the poem, let's go over its main ideas and style. So this particular poem is from the collection Selected Poems in 1975, which I think is the same collection as The Violets was from, but definitely check me on that. Main ideas of this poem. So this is another poem where Harwood is exploring childhood and maturation. But you'll notice as we go through these poems, even though they're exploring similar ideas, each of the poem kind of explores a different aspect of that maturation process. So for Barn Owl, Harwood is exploring how when one moves from being a child to an adult, that's a process of learning about how to exercise personal agency, make decisions for yourself, act as an individual, but also learning about facing the consequences of those actions. Kind of embedded within that process within Barn Owl is an awakening awareness of death, mortality, and the consequences of human violence. As the title of the poem would suggest, this poem also explores the complex relationship between a father and child, where the father figure is both someone who's rejected, but also who acts as a guide and kind of comforted the child by the end of the poem. And within that relationship between father and child, there's this tension that's explored between the child's desire for independence and the influence of relationships on their identity. And for us in Text and Human Experiences, this poem really nicely explores the complexity of human emotions and kind of how different emotions can exist or coexist at the same time, which is helpful for us when we're considering the focus area descriptor. In terms of style and form, Father and Child uses a diptych structure with two connected parts, Barn Owl and Nightfall. So Father and Child is the title of both of the poems together, but for this video we're just looking at the first part, which is Barn Owl. So a diptych is actually a work of art or writing that is made up of two matching parts or panels, often joined together with a hinge, so it looks a little bit like a book. If that doesn't make any sense to you, just Google it, and if you see a picture of a diptych, it will make a lot more sense. But diptych is really an art kind of term, but we use it in literature to just refer to any work of art that has any work of literature that has two connected parts. Okay, so sometimes those parts are connected because they explore the same idea, or maybe they are kind of in contrast to one another. For us, the two poems, Barn Owl and Nightfall, explore the experiences of the same characters, the father and child, but just years apart. So Barn Owl is also a narrative poem, so it is following a clear story. And it's told from first person retrospective perspective, okay? So this is a first person poem and it is the story of a child, but a lot along the way you kind of get the sense that it's probably the adult persona recounting a childhood experience, which is why I say it's a retrospective perspective, because they seem to have a lot of insight into what was going on for them as a child. As we've seen in the other poems, Harwood continues using the cycle of a day as an extended metaphor for kind of human life. And this poem follows a similar structure and rhyme pattern to the glass jar. So we've got 7 sestets, 6-line stanzas, and there's a consistent rhyme pattern. The same thing is happening here that was happening in the glass jar, where this kind of regular rhyme and formal structure is in stark contrast with increasingly kind of chaotic experience for the child persona, okay? So Harwood is using this kind of stylistic choice again in Barn Owl that she used in The Glass Jar. So that's definitely something we can track over some of the poems. Okay, let's briefly talk about the title. So we have two titles to discuss here, Father and Child, which is the overarching title, and then Barn Owl, which is the title of the first part of this poem. So firstly, let's think about the title Father and Child. So by calling the poem Father and Child, it's universalizing the experience represented here. So this is not necessarily just specific to one father and one child. This is a poem exploring experiences which are common or true of the relationship generally between father and their children, fathers and their children. By calling the characters father and child, it immediately puts the identities of the two characters in relationship to each other. You're only a father in relation to a child, you're only a child in relation to a parent, okay? So their identities are embedded in the relationship that exists between them. It's just interesting to note that the child's gender is not specified. In my readings about this poem, I've seen certain people refer to the child as a girl and certain people refer to the child as a boy. I don't think it's clear in the poem, the gender of the child, and so thinking about how we read the child's gender is interesting. Then if we think about Barn Owl, so just like in the violets and the glass jar, the barn owl is the central kind of symbol or motif in the poem. So the owl functions symbolically. And in this poem, the owl comes to act as a kind of mirror that the child sees themselves in. And it's the central catalyst for the transformation of both the child and the child's relationship with the father. It's important to remember that the owl is a symbol in this poem. Okay, let's get into the poem. So I will read these stanzas and then I will point out some things that I think it's important for you to note. Just remember, my annotations are certainly not exhaustive. There is, lots more that we could say about this poem. I'm sure there's things here in the language and the ideas that you will notice that I haven't pointed out. Make sure you note those things down so that you can discuss them with your class teacher and peers. All right. Daybreak, the household slept. I rose, blessed by the sun. A horny fiend, I crept out with my father's gun. Let him dream of a child obedient, angel-minded, old no-sayer, robbed of power by sleep. I knew my prize who swooped home at this hour with daylight-riddled eyes, to his old place on high beam in our old stables, to dream light's useless time away. I stood, holding my breath in urine-scented hay, master of life and death, a wisp-haired judge whose law would punish beak and claw. Okay, so we open this poem at daybreak. We know that times of day are going to be symbolic in Harwood's poetry. So daybreak is obviously going to be symbolic of the beginning of something. I'm going to say probably the beginning of adulthood. It's also important to note that daybreak is a time of transition. So this poem is going to be about the transition in a child's life. The next thing I want you to note is the religious imagery in that opening stanza. So we have the child saying they are blessed by the sun and angel-minded, but also that they're a horny fiend. So there's this juxtaposition between kind of the positive religious imagery and the negative religious imagery, which is suggesting the kind of two sides of the child, or maybe also the kind of childish nature of the child versus the adult, okay? And this idea is starting to even emerge just in this opening stanza about that this is a poem about right and wrong or good and evil and which kind of way the child is going to choose to go. Are they going to be the angel-minded child? Are they going to be the horny fiend? Okay, so we've got the child grabbing the father's gun. Okay, so the first time we hear about the father, he's associated with a gun. So the father is linked to violence and aggression. And this is possibly also framing how the child sees adulthood more broadly. So we know they're about to get the gun in order to shoot the owl. And this action seems to be about the child like exercising their own free will and kind of trying to leave childhood behind them. So it's just interesting to note that they link adulthood with violence. Okay. We have the child calling the father old no-sayer. So this kind of disrespectful tone establishes the child's perspective of the father, that they want to leave the father behind and leave particularly the father trying to control their actions by saying no. They want to leave that behind. They say that the father is robbed of power by sleep. This is pretty ironic because we know that that in the child's mind, it seems that they think just because the father is asleep, he's not going to find out that the child's taken the gun and shot the owl, that he doesn't have any kind of power just because he's asleep. So that's obviously a really naive kind of outlook on the world. So even though the child is trying to kind of act like an adult and exercise some independence, we see here that they still hold this kind of childish and naive view of the world. So he goes on to say, or she goes on to say, I knew my prize. So that is referring to the owl. So the objectification there, describing the owl as a prize, indicates kind of the child's motivation, that they're trying to gain something through what they're going to do to the owl and shooting them. Okay. And then we have these kind of two interesting phrases that are used to describe the owl. Okay, so the persona says the owl has daylight riddled eyes and is going to dream light's useless time away. So that introduces two central motifs that will continue throughout the rest of the poem of light and also eyes. Okay. And when we're thinking about light and eyes, these are symbols usually of kind of understanding or illumination. But the child says that the daylight actually riddles the eyes, okay, which is kind of a bit of an oxymoron or a juxtaposition there. And the child also says that the light's useless. Okay, so the light's useless time away. So there's kind of a misunderstanding from the child's perspective of the importance of seeing. So the importance of understanding, if we think that's what eyes represent, and the importance of light and knowledge. Okay, so again, we're getting a kind of establishment of a child's misunderstanding of what's important. They're standing in the barn looking at the owl, and we have the olfactory imagery of the urine-scented hay. So that's foreshadowing, I think, the physicality and the distasteful killing of the owl. So this is already being represented as kind of a horrible experience even now with the urine-scented hay. And then we have the child describing themselves as the master of life and death. They're describing themselves as a judge who is exercising law upon the owl. So we've got obviously hyperbole in that they're the master of life and death, and we have this kind of legal metaphor where they're presenting themselves as a judge. And that's kind of indicating what the child is trying to do, okay? They're trying to set themselves up as this powerful figure who kind of can do whatever they want to the owl. And they're kind of adopting this, this language of being a master and a judge in order to say that. But we see this pretty ironically because what are they? They're not the master of life and death. They're just trying to shoot kind of a helpless owl. Okay, so there's some irony here. Okay, My first shot struck. He swayed, ruined, beating his only wing, as I watched, afraid by the fallen gun, a lonely child who believed death clean and final. Not this obscene bundle of stuff that dropped and dribbled through loose straw, tangling in boughs and hopped blindly closer. I saw those eyes that did not see mirror my cruelty. Okay, so we open this stanza with this short sentence, my first shot struck. So that short sentence is kind of marking this as a turning point for the child, and that's emphasized by the use of sibilants here. Shot struck, he swayed. Throughout these two set stanzas, we have this pretty violent imagery throughout. So we have the owl described as ruined, and then later dropped and dribbled, tangling in boughs, hopped blindly. So all of this kind of violent imagery is establishing kind of the brutal reality of the child's actions and forces the reader to confront the physical reality of death in the same way that the child is. Okay. And if you go down to the second stanza here, all of that is reinforced by a variety of language techniques that Harwood has chosen. So the alliteration, the verb tangling, and the kind of visceral nature of the image of the bowels. So this is a highly confronting image that's again highlighted by all the use of enjambment. Okay, so just as the child is confronted by the reality of death and violence, so is the reader through the use of this kind of pretty horrific language. The next thing I want you to notice is the shift in language of how the child describes themselves. So remember in the first stanzas, we got the child describing themselves as the master, as a judge. Now the child describes themselves as afraid and a lonely child. So even just think about that, the lonely child versus the master of life and death. So shooting the owl doesn't kind of cause them to see themselves as a powerful adult, which I think they thought it would. Now they see themselves more clearly as just a child with a fallen gun. Okay, so it's ironic that they do kind of see the world and themselves more clearly now, just not in the way that they thought they would. And then we have a juxtaposition between clean and final and obscene. So highlighting the gap between the child's naive expectations of what shooting the owl would be like, that they thought it would be clean and final, and the disturbing reality of death in that it's this kind of obscene action. We have the continued objectification of the owl as a bundle of stuff. And then I want to just talk about this final metaphor here. I saw those eyes that did not see mirror my cruelty. So there's quite a lot going on in this metaphor, and I think it's definitely one that I would encourage you to discuss with your peers and teacher. But all I want to say is that this metaphor is suggesting that the owl's kind of unseeing eyes, so the owl's pain and their suffering, is revealing something about the child that they didn't know before. So they see in the owl's eyes something about themselves. And what they see is that they're capable of immense cruelty, okay, and immense violence. So this looking in the owl's eyes becomes this moment of self-understanding and maturation for the child, but in a way that they didn't expect, okay? I think it's a really interesting metaphor for you to unpack in a bit more depth with your class, but that's just something to kind of get you started. Okay. While the wreck thing that could not bear the light nor hide hobbled in its own blood. My father reached my side, gave me the fallen gun, end what you have begun. I fired. The blank eyes shone once into mine and slept. I leaned my head upon my father's arm and wept, owl blind in early sun, for what I had begun. Okay, so at the start of this stanza, we have kind of a continuation of a bunch of the techniques that we've already had, the continued objectification of the owl as a wrecked thing, the light motif, and the violent imagery. I think, remember at the end of the last stanza, we have the child seeing themselves kind of mirrored back in the owl. I think it's interesting to think about whether the way they continue to describe the owl could also be read as like a description of themselves. Okay, so the child, as well as the owl, is also a wrecked thing. Okay, that can't bear the light, that can't bear the understanding that they've gained, and they can't hide from it either. Okay, so the owl and the child kind of become the same in the ending of the poem. And then we have the entry of the father. So my father reached my side and gave me the fallen gun. So the father giving the child back the gun is symbolic of him requiring the child to bear the consequences of their actions. So remember, the child drops the gun after they shoot the owl for the first time. The father gives it back to them. So it's a symbolic action. You started this, you shot the owl, you have to finish it. You have to bear the consequences of this violent act. And that's reinforced by the direct speech from the father, "End what you have begun." So that use of imperative language here, that commanding tone, really positions the child as a powerful figure, a confident guide for the child. And that's obviously in contrast to how the child describes the father at the start of this poem. There's an antithesis here between end and begun as well. Okay, end what you have begun. So that juxtaposition is happening there. The short sentence, "I fired," heightens the tension at this moment. This is again a turning point for the child. So he or she kills the owl finally and says that the owl is asleep. So obviously we know the owl is not asleep, it's dead. So the use of sleep here is a euphemism for death, and it's kind of a pretty common euphemism people use for death. So I was just thinking there, is this kind of, the child is already kind of adopting adult ways of dealing with mortality by describing death as sleep here, so kind of adopting that adult perspective. And then we end the poem with the child leaning and weeping. So the verb choices there are highlighting the dependence of the child on the father and the pain of what they have discovered. Again, just contrast that with the opening of the poem and they're trying, them trying to exercise independence from the father. Owl blind in early sun so I wept, owl blind in early sun for what I had begun. So owl blind is a really interesting phrase and it's a metaphor. And again, we have the child describing themselves as the owl, okay? Why? I think it's a little bit ambiguous. I think there's lots of things you could say here. Possibly it's about recognizing their own vulnerability, that they are also as vulnerable as the owl was, and that they also lack understanding, like an animal, okay? That what is the difference between them and the owl? We have the reference to early sun here. So again, the symbol of the beginning of something, maybe the beginning of adulthood. And then we have, I think, an ambiguous ending here. So the child weeping for what I had begun, kind of mirroring what the father has said, "And what you have begun." What is it that the child has begun exactly? Okay. What is the child weeping for? What is the pain point here for the child? It's kind of up to you to interpret. I think some possible interpretations, this is the beginning of adulthood and the child realizes that they don't want to go into adulthood because adulthood means understanding things about the nature of humanity as this kind of thing that can exercise like this immense cruelty that the child just has is a thing that's begun kind of understanding the world or understanding themselves, okay? And they want to kind of take that back, okay? Lots of possibilities there, I think, and definitely an ending that I would like you to discuss with your peers and your teachers. But hopefully this video has given you kind of a starting point for doing that. So I'll end the video there, and I will see you in the next video, which will be about the second part of this diptych, father and child, entitled Nightfall. So I will see you then.